the Middle English material for the course. And we don't have as many days assigned for the Middle English portion simply because we don't have Beowulf in it. Beowulf took a long time, okay? It's quite a bit longer than any other things that we will be reading in the Middle English period, unless we were going to do all of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, which would be an entire semester's course, right? Or, we are doing all of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, but it's not as long, and we can skip a lot of it. So, I've got a bunch of dates, and over here, these are kind of issues or ideas to discuss. So let's go back over here and do some revising, as they call in Britain, some kind of cramming. This is a date I didn't have up earlier, but I was thinking about it this morning, and I think it's kind of important that we ought to include. 1054 is the year of what's called the Great Schism. The Great Schism is when you get a rupture in the church. Okay? The Christian church kind of conceived universally. Okay? It's in 1054 that the Eastern Church, what's today called the Orthodox Church, and the Roman Catholic Church divide. Okay? You get a break between them. And depending upon kind of which side of the shore you stand on, you'll say, well, the other one started it. Okay? The Orthodox say, the Catholic Church broke away from us. The Catholics say, the Orthodox Church broke away from us. And essentially what happened is, this involves a number of issues, and some of these issues go back 600 years. Take them back. 400 years before this period. Okay? Issues related to who is the, how do I want to put this? Who is the first among equals, okay, of the patriarchs of the church? The church had 5 what are called ancient patriarchates: Jerusalem, Rome, Antioch, Alexandria, and Constantinople. Okay, who's the greatest of them? And beginning around the mid-5th century, the Pope in Rome began to essentially kind of take some powers and liberties to himself that the other patriarchs didn't necessarily agree with. So if you're familiar with Animal Farm, what is it that the pigs say in Animal Farm?
More equal than others.
All pigs are equal, but some are more equal than others, okay? So you have this idea, all the patriarchs are equal, but one is a little more equal, okay? And what the other patriarchs accepted was that the Pope in Rome is the first among equals. What does that mean? He has preeminence. It did not mean to the early church the idea that the Pope was the singular head of the church. Okay? Each of the patriarchs was head over their quote-unquote patriarchate. Okay? And in order for the church to speak, the patriarchs had to speak with one voice, rather than one voice from on top saying, this is what we mean. Right? So that was one issue. There was another issue brought about in Spain in the Nicene Creed. A phrase was added, okay, about the Holy Spirit, okay, about who the Holy Spirit proceeds from. And it gets added in Spain in this little local council that the Holy Spirit proceeds not only from the Father, but et filius, and the Son. Okay? Prior to that, this was mid-500s, I believe. Prior to that, might have been mid-600s. Prior to that, it was only the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father. Why? Because Jesus says, and I will ask, and the Father will send a comforter. That is, he will proceed from him, etc. So a bunch of other issues gradually come about. And in 1054, the Pope sends an emissary to the, what's called the Ecumenical Patriarch, that is the Patriarch of Constantinople. And the Patriarch of Constantinople does not receive him. So the Pope has given this emissary permission to excommunicate. And the emissary lays down on the altar, I think this is how it occurred, lays down on the altar in the church, what's called the Hagia Sophia in modern day Istanbul, lays down on the altar a papal bull of excommunication. So the Pope is saying to the Patriarch of Constantinople, you are excommunicated. What does that mean? You're no longer a brother. You're no longer really a Christian. You can no longer have the rights of R-I-T-E-S, not R-I-G-T-H-S, the rights of Christianity. That is, you can't take the Eucharist. You can't have last rites. Okay? All these other things. All right? When the Patriarch sees that, he immediately then excommunicates the Pope. Okay? So you have the two sides completely rip apart. They've been separate ever since. Okay? You could kind of call this well, you can't really call it that. I was going to say you could kind of call this the first Reformation, but they're not reforming anything at this point. They're just splitting. Right? So, then 1066. We've talked about these dates, but let's go over this real briefly again. January 1st, Edward the Confessor dies. January 4th, Harold Godwinson is elected king. Okay. September 25th, you get the Battle of Stamford Bridge, where Harold Godwinson defeats his brother, Earl Tosti, and Harold Hardrada, the King of Norway, who have invaded. Okay. October 14th, coming up in just a few days, you get the Battle of Hastings, where William the Conqueror has landed about 2 weeks before this. William the Conqueror lands on the southern coast of England. Harold is going to march back south, okay, and you have a battle of the French against the English. It's about a day-long battle, and Harold Godwinson dies. William of Normandy is victorious, okay. And then on December 25th, William of Normandy is crowned King of England. Right? Over the next, I should add, over about the next 20 years, he is cementing this kingship. That is, he's not crowned King of England. This isn't like an American election where November 9th, God willing, we don't end up with a divided electoral college or whatever. November 9th, we'll know who the next president is. Okay? Well, December 25th, he's crowned king, but there's a lot of holdouts who are against him. And I don't mean against him like there's going to be, roughly half the country's not going to be happy with the election. I mean, armed holdouts. So it takes him about 20 years to fully cement that. How does he do that? He goes around England and kills the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy. Every last one of them. All of the Anglo-Saxon earls are dead by 1086. Okay. William of Normandy essentially decapitates Anglo-Saxon aristocracy. Why? He gets rid of their leaders. The underlings aren't going to rise up if they don't have people to follow. Okay. 1095, the Crusades begin. What are the Crusades? Ostensibly, well, we're going to free the Holy Lands from those, damned pagans, from those Saracens, okay, the Muslims, etc. That's ostensibly what they're about. But they aren't all about freeing the Holy Lands from Muslims. How do we know? Because one of the Crusades is against Constantinople, which isn't controlled by Muslims. It's controlled by the Orthodox. Okay? This is why this is important. You have, the Western Church attack essentially the Eastern Church. So you have Christians killing Christians. Okay? Skip a few hundred years, or excuse me, a little over 100 years. 1154, this Henry II is William the Conqueror's grandson. Right? In the mid 12th century, about the 1130s, you got about a 20-year period of civil war, where one of William's sons is essentially fighting a civil war against a brother's widow. The brother is dead. But we're going to skip over that. So 1154, Henry II becomes king. He rules for a little over 30 years. Right? He's important because of his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, and because it's under his reign, it's during his reign that we see this real flourishing of literary output. We see this rise of literature. Okay? It's also during his reign we see this rise of Arthurian literature. Okay? In fact, it's under Henry II that we get this come into play, the courtly love tradition, which we'll talk about in a moment. Okay? If you want to get a good kind of flavor, a good feel for Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, I highly recommend the film Lion in Winter with Peter O'Toole and Katharine Hepburn, where Peter O'Toole plays Henry II, and Katharine Hepburn is just fantastic as Eleanor of Aquitaine. Because Eleanor, there's no other way to describe her. She was a formidable old, okay, I'm going to be completely sexist. Please don't take offense. She was a formidable old broad. I mean, she was, you did not go wrong against Eleanor of Aquitaine. Because even after he dies, okay, she lives. She lives, in fact, until shortly after John dies. So she's alive when her son, Richard I, is king. And she's kind of back there pulling the strings. Because Richard spends most of his time outside England. He spends roughly 9.5 years of his reign off fighting the Crusades. Only 6 months of his reign is spent in England. By the way, none of these guys, from William, I don't even have him up here, up until Henry IV, Henry V, which is after Chaucer, none of them are native English speakers. They all speak French. Henry V is the first of what are called the Plantagenet kings, who grows up speaking English. Henry IV does know English. He does speak English, but he had to be taught it. Okay? Marie de France is writing under the kind of the court approval, let's say, of Henry and Eleanor. She's the writer of what are called Breton Lays, which we'll be talking about. That's Lanval, which we'll be doing today. Okay? 1170, Thomas Becket is assassinated. Okay? Thomas Becket is the Archbishop of Canterbury. And here's the little story you need to understand about Thomas Becket. In some texts, he's called Thomas a Becket, kind of Becket. Okay? Henry II, before he married Eleanor of Aquitaine, he and Thomas Becket used to hang out, to use the common parlance. They were good buddies. They were drinking buddies. They were whoring buddies. They were gambling buddies. They did everything together. Okay? Henry becomes king. The Archbishop of Canterbury dies. And he comes up with the bright idea of making his best friend Archbishop. Right? He has the authority as king to name archbishops. So, he's going to name his best friend Archbishop of Canterbury. Why? Because then he has some control over the church. Because he has some control over his friend. Becket pleads with him, don't do this. Don't do this. Why? Because Becket has the kind of character that says, if you make me Archbishop of Canterbury, I will truly become Archbishop of Canterbury. That is, I will take this role deathly seriously. In other words, whoring, drinking, gambling, not anymore. He will truly become, so to speak, a Christian. Henry doesn't listen to him. He makes Thomas Becket Archbishop of Canterbury. And they immediately do this. Okay? Because Henry wants Becket to tax churchgoers to help fund wars. Becket doesn't want to. Henry wants to raid the church treasury. Becket won't let him. Now you have to remember or know, at this time, the church owned roughly half the property of England. Crown owned most of the rest, but, the aristocracy, dukes, nobles, and such, owned some also. So it keeps going, they keep being at loggerheads. Becket flees England. He goes off to the Pope. I should mention here that there are 2 popes at this time. There's one in Rome, and then there's what's called the Avignon. What's the other word? Do you remember, Bill?
Apart from exile from Rome.
Yeah, I can't remember. There's an actual phrase. Anyway, you got the Pope in Rome, and then you have a Pope in Avignon, France. Okay, he goes to the one in Avignon, France. Okay, and the Pope there tells him, "You got to go back. You got to go back." He's like, "But if I go back, he'll kill me." You have to go back. Why? What's the life of a Christian? What are Christians, quote unquote, called to? If you would follow me, take up your cross and follow me. Self-denial. So Becket goes back. He and Henry are loggerheads again. Come Christmas, 1170, anecdotally, this is what we are told happens. Okay? There are stories of this contemporaneous to the account, to the time. Henry is at his castle in Westminster, and he's drinking around December 28th, because I'm pretty sure it's December 29th that Becket is killed. He's drinking, and he rails to his guards, "Will no one rid me of this meddlesome priest?" That's the quote that it is said, contemporaneous with the time of Becket, that Henry said. Okay? So 3 of his knights armor up, get on their horses, and ride to Canterbury. Canterbury's not that far. It's 70 miles, something like that. About an hour and a half by train from London. And they ride to Canterbury. Word has reached Thomas that they're coming. He goes to the high altar in the cathedral. You can go to the spot where he was actually murdered today. They have this ugly modern art sculpture there. Completely ridiculous. Okay? And Becket is praying at the altar when the 3 knights come in and kill him. They spill his blood on the altar. Okay? England is outraged over this. Okay? Henry does penance. The penance he does is he apologizes. He's like, "I didn't really mean it. White people would do what I really told them to do." So he rides to Canterbury. He gets down off his horse at the walls of Canterbury, and then he crawls, hands and knees, to the cathedral door, showing his contrition. Okay? And what is it? I think 11 years later, Becket is made a saint, which is really fast in the Catholic Church. I mean, it's really fast even back then. Right? Mother Teresa was just made a saint about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago. Okay? Only been 20 years. John Paul was made a saint, like within 20 years. Right? So Thomas of Becket dies, and people immediately start going to Canterbury on pilgrimage. Okay? 1189 to 99, as I said, we have Richard I, Richard the Lionheart. I mean, this is in all the Robin Hood movies, This is Sean Connery. This is Patrick Stewart. I mean, this is this great idea of Englishness, even though Sean Connery is Scottish, but we won't talk about that. Okay? The guy didn't speak English. He didn't really care about England. You go to London today, you go to Parliament, and right there, right outside those beautiful halls of Parliament, is this statue of Richard the Lionheart on his horse. Completely ridiculous. Okay? So he dies, and his brother John, and if you're familiar with the Disney version of Robin Hood, what do they call John? John the Worst. Okay? Why? Because in 1204, John loses Normandy. What does that mean? Like, Normandy is the ancestral homeland of William of Normandy. The whole line traces back to Normandy. John loses it in wars in France. Okay? Part of, Henry II's wanting tithes and money from the church and stuff was for what? Was to fight wars in France. Who's he fighting? He's fighting the King of France. Why? Because he thinks he ought to be King of France and King of England. Richard, same thing. Eleanor, same thing. Aquitaine is a very large province in France. So when she marries Henry, he immediately becomes king of that large property in France. Okay? But here's a little wrinkle, because I don't have this up here anymore. The feudal system. Okay? Feudal system is where you have, let's say, kings, dukes, or barons, knights, etc. down below. So what does that mean? As with the Anglo-Saxon period, what does a good king do for his thane? He gives out treasure, gives out spoils of war. What does the thane do for his king? He fights for him. Okay? Same thing in the vassalage or the feudal system, but in this system, you have the dukes, the knights, the soldiers, etc., swear what's called fealty to their lord. Okay? They swear an oath of loyalty to their lord. They don't necessarily do that in the Anglo-Saxon period. Okay? And their lord, the king, ultimately, the king does what? He says, hand me your sword. You give him your sword. He takes his sword and does what? The knighting ceremony, which the queen still does today. It's completely meaningless today, however. Right? So, when that happens, you then become the servant of that person. And now I said, Henry became king essentially of Aquitaine. But Aquitaine is like Texas to Washington, D.C. What do I mean? What's the analogy? What's Washington, D.C.? Or what does it represent? The federal government. Where's Texas to the federal government? I know, the 10th Amendment, It's supposed to be kind of subservient to it, right? Or Texas to the United States. That would be better. Texas is part of the United States. It's not above the United States, is it? Aquitaine is part of France. It's not above France. So, while he might be king of Aquitaine, Aquitaine is subservient to all of France, which makes him essentially a vassal to the king of France, even though he's king of England. Kings don't like being vassals to anybody else. Okay? If I'm king, be king of the whole, kit and caboodle kind of an idea. So, war breaks out. And you have the King of England trying to take over France. Well, this goes on for a long time. This is not, by the way, this thing that we're talking about. This is not part of the 100 Years' War. This is just kind of dynastic politics by another means, if you want. Okay? So, in 1204, John loses Normandy. This would be like George H.W. Bush losing Kennebunkport. Or it would be like, the Kennedys losing Hyannisport. It'd be like Bill Gates losing Seattle, because he essentially owns it. This is huge. Okay? Also, what this does is it turns the English monarchy's mind to home. That is, the home they now reside in, England. It spurs nationalism. Okay? 1215. Magna Carta. What is Magna Carta? Okay, it's Latin, right? Great Charter. What did Magna Carta do? Anybody know? Magna Carta restricted the power of the king. Why? Because John is taxing the nobles and the everyday ordinary people out of their livelihoods. He is depriving people of their livelihoods. He's putting people in jail. He's taking their land and property. Why? So he can sell it to raise money to try to take back Normandy. And the dukes, the nobles, the barons finally say, that's it. We've had enough. And they come up with the Great Charter. What does Magna Carta do? It says, we, nobles and barons, have a right to a trial by a jury of our peers. We must be charged when we are arrested. In other words, no more just throwing people in jail and rot forever. Okay? We have a right to petition Parliament for grievances against the king. We have a right to a Parliament, that is, a regular annual meeting where Parliament, okay, from the root word parl, which means to talk, a group, talking to do what? To entirely, as a group, address our grievances to the king. We have a right to that yearly. Parliament had been meeting before this, but it was kind of, haphazard. If the king didn't want Parliament to meet, then the king wouldn't have Parliament meet. And we do have the king up into the 1600s. We do have the king dissolving Parliament, saying, I don't need your advice or input anymore. Okay? Legally, that could still happen today. The Queen could dissolve Parliament if there were a national crisis. Okay? So, Magna Carta is designed to give some power to the people and to restrict the power of the king. Right? Also in 1215, you get what's called the Fourth Lateran Council. This is a council of the Catholic Church. All right? One of the goals of the Fourth Lateran Council is to kind of improve, let's say, Christian behavior. Okay? To improve the behavior of Christians within the church. Well, what do I mean? For example, the Fourth Lateran Council mandates, it requires every Christian must, at least once a year, have a formal confession with a priest. They got to go at least once. Every Christian must take communion at least once a year. Okay? It also mandated, priests ought to know Latin. Why? Because they're saying the Mass in Latin. Okay? So that you don't end up with things like this. This, it is suggested by some, is where the phrase hocus pocus comes from. Hoc est corpus, and then you have a male over here. This is my body, broken for you. Well, what else does the Lateran Council do? It establishes, that is, it says it is a doctrine of the church. This is not something to be debated. Okay? What's called transubstantiation. Which means when the priest holds up the host and says, "This is my body shed for you. This is my blood shed for you." At that moment, that piece of bread and that glass of wine turn into the actual physical blood and body of Christ. So that when you are eating and drinking the communion, you are physically eating and drinking the blood and body of Christ. No, it does not taste like blood and flesh. Why? Because they distinguish between what's called substance and accidents. Okay? For example, substance and accidents. The accidents of this is paper. It's what it looks like. It's what it appears as. It's what it feels like. What is the substance, the essence of this? What's it actually composed of? Wood. This is wood, just like those trees right out the window. Same stuff, but it appears differently. So, the Middle English pronunciation, the substance of the communion meal, its appearance, its texture, its taste, all that kind of stuff. Sorry, the accidents, its appearance, texture, taste, and all that is bread and wine. Its substance, however, is body and blood. Okay? What else? 1337 to 1453. You then have the 100 Years' War break out between England and France. Okay? It's during this period that we get Joan of Arc. It's during this period, in the early part of the 1400s, we have Henry V, okay, widely regarded as the best loved of all English monarchs. All right. 1348 to 49, we get the Black Death, or plague, rolls through Europe. Okay. And it's estimated that probably about a third of the population of Europe was wiped out. So, think of the United States, we've got roughly 330 million people, take out 110 million. What does that mean? Take out California, Florida, and Texas. That would probably, no, that wouldn't even be close. And New York.
I've heard it is estimated like about half of the South will be taken out.
Okay, it's huge. Murfreesboro is 130,000, take out 45,000 people. Okay? And this creates problems, you could say. Where does the Black Death hit primarily? How does it spread? Bubonic plague, okay. It's spread from the fleas on the rats. People get bit, but then how does it spread? Coughing, sneezing, wheezing, hacking. I always love it when students come up and you get right this in my face and say, back off, you know. Okay? In cities, London at this time, London is like a tenement. Okay? Everybody's packed into a very small area. And I mean packed, because in the Middle Ages, probably by 1350, London itself probably had about 100,000 people in about a 2 square mile footstep or footprint. That's a lot of people in a very small location. It's not much better today if you go to London. Okay? Huge city, a lot of people, very small location. So, people in the city start dying like flies. What kind of opportunities does that create? Just imagine if a horrible plague like that were to sweep through the United States today. What would happen economically? Two things at least. One, there'd be a drop in the economy. Why? Because output would drop. Why would output drop? Because there's nobody there to build the stuff. Okay? Nobody where to build the stuff. In the cities. Okay? Because it's the cities that are hit primarily. So then, what happens? Well, nature abhors a vacuum. So you have all these people dying in the cities, and then you got these poor slobs who are tied to the land out in the country, thinking, maybe I can change my fate. Okay, this is the good thing about The Knight's Tale, the film, okay? With the character of William Thatcher. Maybe he can change his stars, because we see people moving from the country into the city to take over the jobs that are now available. After, the plague kind of runs its course. They're not moving in to cart the bodies out and, to be the next one to die. Okay? So, during this period, roughly 1300 to 1400, we see the rise of a middle class. Okay? People who are starting businesses, people who are learning skills and trades. So you have the upper class, you have the lower class still, the churls, okay? But then we see these people who, today they would simply be called entrepreneurs, small business owners. What kind of small business? Owning an inn, owning a pub, starting a blacksmith shop, starting a cartwright shop, etc. Okay? 1343, or about there, Chaucer was born. Dies in 1400. He is ransomed by the King of England from France when he's only 16. That is, he's captured during the 100 Years' War. He's not over there as a soldier. We think he's over there as a spy at 16. Okay? And he gets ransomed by the king himself, indicating Chaucer's kind of, made a little name for himself, so to speak. Beginning around 1385 is when he starts Canterbury Tales. He's already been writing other stuff from the 1360s on. Okay? 1350 to 1375, you have what's called the alliterative revival. What's meant by that? It's this attempt by a variety of writers to revive the old English form of alliteration. The problem is they don't know the rules. Okay? And it's not like these writers all get together at a pub one evening and they say, hey, let's try to revive the Anglo-Saxon. It doesn't happen in London. It happens in northwest England, okay, out away from London, probably where some of the native tradition remained, in some form at least. And what we see is these writers start writing in this fashion. For example, in a poem called The Vision of Piers Plowman, you have a line that goes like this. In a fair field full of folk, found I there. Fair field full folk, found. 1, 2, 3, 4. You have 5 stressed syllables. Okay, again, in Old English, you'd have 4, and only 3 of them would alliterate, and the last one would never alliterate. Here, all 5 of them alliterate. Okay. This, in the hands of a really poor writer, gets to be really bad poetry. I mean, really bad, okay? The Lyman, the guy who wrote Piers Plowman, is not really bad. If he actually understood the rules, he probably would have done it fantastically. But we're going to do Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which is commonly regarded as probably the greatest example of the alliterative revival. It's in this that we get a whole bunch of Arthurian material. The alliterative Morte d'Arthur, the alliterative Arthur, alliterative stuff about Merlin, a bunch of other things. Okay? 1381, we have the Peasants Revolt. What is that? That is a result of an act passed in 1375, the Statute of Laborers. And what that act did was it said, it made official law of the land. Laborers cannot make more than X wage. Okay, now, who do you think put that law through Parliament? Laborers? No, the people paying the laborers. That is, the aristocracy. Okay? That then leads, just a few years later, to the Peasants Revolt. They're the laborers. Okay? So what do? They march on London. And the king, Richard II, pretends to agree to their demands, gets them to leave London, and then slaughters them. That is, those that marched on London, killed them all. Okay? At a place called Runnymede.
So you said statute of the laborers was passed in 1359?
1375. I just didn't include it on there. So you think we have labor problems today, you know. At least you're not getting your head lopped off for us, saying, I'm going to raise. 1454, Johannes Gutenberg. I think it's 1454. Johannes Gutenberg in Germany invents the movable printing press. He's not the first one, by the way. The Chinese have had movable type for several hundred years by this point. But he invents the printing press, which makes it possible to do what? Spread anything. Whereas before, if you wanted a copy of Bede's Ecclesiastical History, you had to pay some monk to hand copy the entire book. Now, you pay some printer to set it up and type, and you could print off 20 copies in a month or in a week. So, written material becomes widely available. What is going to happen as a result of that? People are going to want to be able to read. So we see a rise in literacy. Okay? Huge rise in literacy. It's estimated that by Shakespeare's day, probably 85-90% of the population was illiterate. Okay? 1600. 85-90% of the population was literate. Don't mean to burst any bubbles. That's higher than in the United States. Adult population. I'm not talking, 3-year-olds. Okay? Adult population. Okay? 1485, William Caxton, Prince, Mallory's Le Morte d'Arthur. All right? So we now get printed versions of Arthurian tales. It's not the first thing he prints, by the way. There's a couple other things he prints before that. And then we also have in 1485, and this kind of brings to a conclusion, okay, the Middle English period, the Battle of Bosworth Field, when Henry Tudor defeats Richard III, and he becomes Henry VII. Shakespeare famously, captured the scene in Richard III where Richard on the field cries, a horse, my kingdom for a horse, because he wants to flee. And he can't. Okay? Richard is killed, and his body is lost to history until 2012 in the town of Leicester, as we would say in America, Leicester, Leicester. Okay? Yeah, Leicester. Where they're digging up a parking lot, and they find the remains of what they think is a medieval abbey. So they immediately bring in the archaeologists. They do discover remains of an abbey, and then they also discover a lead-lined coffin. And in that lead-lined coffin is the body of a man whose back, or whose backbone, looks like this. Severe scoliosis. Well, Shakespeare describes Richard III as the hunchback king. Hunchback meaning like this. He's not like this, however. That is, he doesn't have a big hump on his back. He's like this because his back isn't straight. And the body is discovered. It's got a big crack in the skull and a couple of stab wounds and an arrow wound. Okay? DNA analysis 2 years later proves it's Richard III. So one of the great mysteries of what happened to Richard III is solved by digging up a parking lot. Cue the Pave Paradise and put up a parking lot. So, okay. So that's all that backwards. Let me talk about these things for a moment. The three estates. Maybe we'll get the long haul. The three estates was this belief, and Chaucer will kind of address this in some of his work, is this idea that society is divided into three groups. We even hear this kind of language today. Okay? Only we hear it in reference to the fourth estate. What's the fourth estate in the United States? Journalism. Journalists are supposed to be the fourth estate. Okay? They're the ones who are supposed to do what? Keep an eye on government, to keep a watch out, to make sure they're doing what they ought to be doing. Personally, I don't think they're doing a very good job of it. Okay? So the three estates. Society is divided into three groups or levels. You have the church. Okay? You have the military/aristocracy. And everybody else. Okay? Who's going to be at the top of this? Well, let me put it this way. Who is definitely not at the top? Yeah, everybody else. Okay? Because down here, these are what Marx would love to call the workers, the proletariat. Okay? They kind of vibe back and forth between who's on top. I mean, obviously, the king is supreme. So archbishops can't excommunicate kings, and kings can't excommunicate archbishops. Showing that ultimately the church has the upper hand. Why? Because the king has temporal power. The king can screw around with you and your body here. The church can screw around with your soul forever. By excommunication, as an example. Okay? Talk a little bit about chivalry and courtly love. Chivalry arises during roughly the period around Henry II. Okay, so what is chivalry? Chivalry is a code of conduct. MTSU now requires, this, what is it, the blue code or whatever the stupid thing is, the MTSU honor code, so to speak. Okay? The code of conduct for chivalrous knights or for chivalry is pretty much encapsulated in this oath called the Pentecost Oath. Mallory actually gives us an example of the Pentecost Oath. Okay? And it is an oath sworn by knights every year on Pentecost. Okay? Here are some of the things included in the Pentecost Oath. That a knight will defend the defenseless. A knight will protect women. A knight will aid orphans. Okay? A knight will never take advantage of a woman in any way, sexually, monetarily, so nothing. Okay? Why? Because women are up here. Women are put on the proverbial pedestal. All right? Ultimately, I think, and I don't think anybody's ever argued this in an article, I think ultimately this is based on the parable of the Last Judgment given in Matthew 25. Where Christ talks about, those who are going to enter heaven and those who are going to enter hell. Those who are going to enter heaven, he says, do it on the basis of what? Inasmuch as you did it unto the least of these, you did it unto me. What's the did it? Gave a cold drink of water in my name, visited me in prison, clothed me when I was naked, fed me when I was hungry, helped me when I was alone, all those kinds of things. Okay? I think that this idea is ultimately based upon that, because that's what we see good knights doing, those kinds of things. In other words, it's ultimately based on humility. Because what is humility? Humility isn't, oh, I'm horrible. Humility is, oh, you're good. Humility is always putting somebody else before yourself. Always doing that. Okay? While the courtly love tradition can involve chivalry, that is, you can have chivalrous knights in the courtly love tradition, the courtly love tradition ultimately is not Christian. I think chivalric tradition ultimately is Christian. So why is this not? Because at its core, it's adulterous. How so? Well, in the courtly love tradition, here's how it works. You have a lord and lady, a knight who owns a castle, or a baron or duke or something like that, who owns a castle. He is married, and beneath him, vassals to him, are a bunch of knights. They serve him. Okay? But they also swear vassalage to his wife. I will do whatever you command. Okay? In the courtly love tradition, usually what happens is the lady will then promise her quote-unquote favors to whichever of the knights can do some wonderful deed. In some of the literature, go off, kill a dragon, slay a troll, free a city. Okay? So you have 2 or 3 knights, or 4 knights maybe, who are trying to do the greatest martial feats to win her favor. Win her favor is a nice euphemism for sleep with her. All right? What does that do to old idea of, I don't know, marriage vows? Throw them out the window. Okay? Greatest example of courtly love tradition. Arthurian literature. You have Arthur. What does Arthur have beneath him? The Knights of the Round Table, or Knights of the Table Round. He's got his drop-dead gorgeous Welsh wife, right? Guinevere. Think, what's Michael Douglas's wife's name? Catherine Zeta-Jones, who's Welsh. She'd be a good Guinevere, okay? And meanwhile, Arthur has all of his knights. Guinevere's over here, and what's Guinevere doing? Hey there, Sir Gawain. Come here. Tristan, come here. Bors, come on. What do we see in Lanval? We see that exact thing happen. Okay? But there are actually, in the courtly love tradition, there is a code of courtly love. You can look it up online, and you'll probably find a list of like 31 rules for a courtly lover. If you want to be a real courtly lover, you have to follow these 31 rules. For example, you fall in love with your lord's lady, you don't talk to anybody about it. You keep it a secret. Okay? What else? If you really are in love with her, you're going to show signs of love sickness. Love sickness was an actual medical diagnosis. What is it characterized by? Well, for men, it's characterized by not being able to properly dress in the morning. Because life is just so worthless without her. So you don't button up your shirt correctly. If you're in the Renaissance, you don't pull up your stockings properly. You don't have your hat on properly. Your hair is kind of a mess. Okay? You walk around all day and all you do is look down at the ground and go, And then if she sees you or you see her, you smile. And if she sees you and smiles at you, it's like Christmas every day. And if she turns and frowns, you kill yourself. Because life isn't worth living anymore. Okay? What else? In courtly love, the courtly love tradition, you don't marry, okay, for love. You marry for expediency. You marry for connections, networking. All right? Real love, passionate love, is kind of reserved for this courtly love relationship. Okay. So what happens with that kind of love? You mentioned Guinevere. What happens between Guinevere and Lancelot? Well, in most of the stories, Guinevere goes off and lives in a monastery, a convent. Lancelot dies in battle. What's another great courtly love tradition? Tristan and Isolde, which is even better than Lancelot and Guinevere. It's about the most beautiful love romance story in existence. Okay? They both die. Even Romeo and Juliet is a courtly love story of sorts. Only problem with it is a couple of stupid teenagers. Grow up. Okay. Last 15, 20 minutes. Turn to Lanval. Okay. Marie de France, her last name is telling us she's of France. She's at the court of Eleanor of Aquitaine. Oh, I should have mentioned this. Eleanor actually set up in the court, and this is why it's called courtly love, a court of love. That is kind of a religious cult, if you want, of love. Okay? Where there were priests of love. And they did that because she had working for her a monk named Andreas, and I'm probably spelling his last name wrong, Capellanus. Okay? And Andreas Capellanus translated a Roman work by the Roman poet Ovid. The guy who wrote Metamorphoses. He also wrote Ars Amatoria, okay? Which Capellanus translates as the art of love. Okay? Ars Amatoria, the art of love. Now here's the problem. As with much stuff that Ovid wrote, Ovid is writing satire. Ovid's Ars Amatoria is essentially a how-to book for dirty old men to get sexy young girls in their beds. Not young girls, prepubescent, sexy young women, okay? But it's a satire. He's not serious about it. He's writing it to kind of discuss the decadence of Rome. All right? When Andreas Capellanus translates that, he is unaware of the satiric element. He thinks this is a how-to manual. How to get a beautiful girl in 30 days. My kids were watching last night. What's the movie, Matthew McConaughey? How to Lose a Lover in... Yeah, something like that. Okay? So he writes this, he translates. Eleanor thinks, oh, this is so wonderful. And so they set up this whole court of love. All right? So Marie de France is writing within that tradition, but she's writing Breton, what are called Breton lays. Okay? She's not writing in English. She's writing in Breton, which is a form of French. Okay? The Bretons were the people who fled Britain when the Anglo-Saxons and the Jutes came in. They fled across the English Channel to what is now called Brittany, Little Britain. All right? Breton lays are characterized by, get rid of all this. You have a love or romance element. Okay. You have a knight of some sort. You have an adventure of some sort. And then lastly, and really these two are the most important ones, the love and the last one, there is a supernatural element. Always a supernatural element. Okay? So, look at Lanval. Notice, it opens and we're told, I'm telling you the story exactly as it happened. And this is at the time of King Arthur. Okay? When Arthur was staying at Carlisle, one of the supposed seats of Camelot. And we're told it's Pentecost. The king's there. He's giving all kinds of gifts out to his men. And he gives rich gifts both to counts, to noblemen. This is around line 14. To the members of the round table. They had no equal in all the world. In other words, these are the greatest knights in the world. Page 219. Okay? But he gives this to everybody except one. Lanval, whom he does not remember. Arthur doesn't remember Lanval for some reason. Okay? Nor do any of his men favor him. In other words, it's like he's ignored. For his valor, his generosity, his beauty, his prowess, most people envied him. Who are the most people? Where they must not be the king's knights. So it's the other people. It's the third estate. Okay? He was a king's son of high lineage, part of the king's household, but Lanval had spent all his wealth. Okay? For the king gave him nothing, nor did Lanval ask him for anything. So, because he's poor, Lanval's unhappy, sorrowful, and dolorous. And so what does he do? He does what you should never do based upon medieval English literature. If you're sad and full of dolor and unhappy, you should never get on your horse, ride out into the woods, and take a nap up against a tree near a babbling brook. Why? Because whenever that happens, you're going to be visited by the fairies. So, that's exactly what he does. He unfolds the end of his mantle, lays it down, makes a pillow, he falls asleep. Or doesn't fall asleep. It's not exactly clear. He sees two maidens coming. He'd never seen any more beautiful. They're richly dressed. They say, Lanval, come with me. He goes with them. And he meets a beautiful lady. Okay? And we're given a description of her tent. We're told her tent is more beautiful than anything on earth. I'm skipping a bunch. And that it's so valuable, the narrator says, I can't even give you an estimate. But there, inside the tent, line 93, was the maiden. She surpassed in beauty the lily or the new rose when it appears in summer. Why the lily and why the rose? What's the lily represent? What color is it? White. Purity. Why the rose? Love. Passion. Okay? She lay on a very beautiful bed. The sheets were worth a castle in nothing but her shift. What does it mean, in nothing but her shift? She's like been to Victoria's Secret or Frederick's Folly. Okay? She ain't wearing much, in other words. Her body was very elegant and comely. She had thrown on for warmth a costly mantle of white ermine. Okay? White ermine is reserved, like the color purple we're going to hear later, for royalty. So this is telling us she's royal of some sort. Her side was entirely uncovered, her neck, her face, her neck, and her breast. That is, she's cold. Of course, she doesn't have anything on, really. She's got like a sheer curtain over her. And she's lying there. To make herself a little bit warmer, she pulls up this mantle of white ermine. But where does she pull it? Just kind of up her side and over her shoulders. All the front is exposed. She was whiter than hawthorn blossom. The knight went forward. She calls to him. He sits down. And she says, "For you have come out of my own land. I've come from afar to look for you. If you are valiant and courteous, no emperor, count, or king ever had such joy or good fortune." Notice the condition. If you are valiant and courteous, what's it sound like she's going to demand? Go slay me a dragon. Okay? What does she mean by valiant? I love you more than anything. He looks at her, sees that she's beautiful. Love stings him with a spark that lights and inflames his heart. Yeah, I'll bet other parts of him are inflamed too. Just not going to go there. And he says, "If it pleased you that such joy should come to me, that you should wish to love me, you could command nothing that I would not do to the best of my power." There is his courtly lover's oath. He is saying, "I'm yours to command." Okay? "For you I will give up everyone." And she says, "Okay, I like that." And so she, 133, grants him her love and body. Monty Python would probably refer to her as a tart or something. Okay? Now Lanval is on the right path, and she gives him another gift. What? He'll never be poor. He will never again want for anything. The more richly he spends, notice, the more gold and silver he will have. Well, how does that work out? You give everything away and then you get more? Yeah. Okay. So she says, "I have one command." This is the valiant part. She says, "I will love you. I will be there when you just call out my name and I'll be there," channeling James Taylor. "But you ever mention me to anybody, that's it, deal's broken. You're poor, and you'll never see all of this again." And he's like, "Don't worry, not a problem." Okay? So he leaves. He goes back home, and what does he notice when he gets home? His men are all now dressed really fine. They're dressed to the nines. What else? He gets in his house is loaded. He starts throwing parties. Everybody comes. And he gives out wealth. Okay? We're told he distributes to people. I'm going to pick up with 205. There was no knight in the town who greatly needed sustenance whom Lanval does not have brought to him and well and richly served. That is, if anybody was in need, Lanval serves his need. He gave rich gifts. He ransomed prisoners. He clothed minstrels. He did great honor. There was no stranger or dear friend to whom Lanval would not give. In other words, he was the model Good Samaritan that Christ talks about in that parable. Okay? But no, he can see his beloved any time of the day or night. So, one day, Feast of St. John, Sir Gawain and his buddies are hanging around the castle, and they say, we ought to invite Lanval. So they go get Lanval, and so the guys are out there messing around down in a courtyard. Meanwhile, Guinevere's up in her castle tower with her ladies. They're looking out, and the ladies are looking down at all the men going, And so they go out to the men. Lanval doesn't want to have anything to do with it, so it's just Guinevere and Lanval. So she calls for Lanval. And notice what she says. 263. I have honored you greatly and loved you and held you very dear. You can have all my love, so tell me your desire. Notice the tone she takes as compared to the other ladies. She has kind of this queenly Oh, Lanval, I've loved you more than all, and yes, you can love me now. I am willing to be your lover. You should be delighted with me. Did the other lady say, look at me, you should be? No. The narrator says, drop dead gorgeous. Lanval, lady, let me be. That is, lady, let me go. I have no interest in loving you. You know, he does something I didn't mention here. He violates a rule of courtesy. In the courtly love tradition, a knight cannot turn down a lady if doing so makes her feel bad.
Well,
Yeah. So what position does that put the knight in? Damn. What does he say? No, lady, I can't. Look at her reply. Well, notice what else he says. I have no interest in loving you. Why? I serve the king, and I don't want to betray my faith to him. See? Lanval is saying, chivalry is my highest code, not this courtly love code. Never for you or for your love shall I wrong my lord. She says, notice, she spoke angrily, and spoke wrongly. It's quite clear to me you have no interest in that pleasure. What does she mean? You don't like ladies. People have often told me you have no desire for women. You have shapely young men and take your pleasure with them. You're gay. Okay? You're gay. Of course, they wouldn't have used the term gay. Base, coward, infamous wretch, my lord is greatly harmed by having allowed you near him. I believe he will lose God by it. Notice what she says. By even having you in the household, Arthur will be damned. You know, if only somebody had told Hrothgar that about Uther, okay? He says, what? That's my translation for it. I know nothing about that line of work. I love and am the beloved of one who should be valued more highly than all the women I know. Oh, he did it again. So he not only turned her down so that she was upset, but he also said, oh, and by the way, my lover, you know, you're a skag compared to her. He's actually going to use the phrase, you're not even as good as one of her scullery maids. One of the women in the kitchen who washes her dishes or empties her chamber pot. He's telling the queen, you're not even worthy to empty out her chamber pot. She was very upset and angry that he had rejected her. She took to her bed sick. Okay? So, Lanval goes off away, but what has he done? Okay, not only has he violated these rules, he spoke about his lover. He was supposed to. Notice why I say that's the valiant thing. He's loved by one, and she says, you can't say anything about me. Where's the valiance? Where's the courage? What would he have to take if he doesn't say anything about her? He'd have to take all of Guinevere's rage. He'd have to take all of her criticism and just go, just grin and bear it. Okay? So he goes back home, and what does he find? She's not there when he calls. He tries different numbers. She's not answering. Okay? He boasted 320 of such a beloved one who was so elegant, noble, and proud that her chambermaid, the poorest girl who served her, was more worthy than the queen. And the king got extremely angry. Because Arthur's thinking, what? You're saying my wife isn't good enough to empty your pot in the morning? So, we'll stop here. Look at the situation. The queen is angry. Arthur is now angry. Lanval has nothing now. Okay? So when we come back a week from today, We will finish Lanval and get into, I believe it's Sir Down in the Green Knight. Yeah, and start Sir Down in the Green Knight. Go ahead and have all those lines read. Good job on the exams, by the way.